Welcome, everybody. We'll be starting very shortly. Well, welcome everybody. Welcome to this C&D webinar entitled, What are tactical nuclear weapons and will they lead to Armageddon? There is huge concern that the war in Ukraine will go nuclear. There's endless speculation in the media, some of it well-informed, some not at all. In all this debate, the term tactical nuclear weapons has come to prominence and is now common currency. But what does that actually mean? What is a tactical nuclear weapon? Is it actually a smaller and less powerful bomb that some people like to suggest? What would its impact be? And could it lead to all-out nuclear Armageddon? We're very fortunate to have three expert guest speakers with us this evening. They're each going to speak for around 8 minutes, and then we'll have a Q&A session. So as we go along, as you feel moved to do so, please put your questions in the Q&A box, and we hope that we'll be able to get to all of them. So first of all, I'm going to welcome David Cullen, who's Director of the Nuclear Information Service. David, over to you.
Good evening. Really glad to be here, and thanks to CND for hosting this webinar on such an important topic. I'm going to speak first of all about Russian and US weapons of this category. I'll say what the two countries have and then say a little bit about what it's best to call them. And then I'll speak a bit about the UK's position. So in the US case, we're talking about around 200 bombs dropped by planes, planes with shorter ranges generally. And these bombs have variable yields. So before they are dropped, the size of the explosion can be set by the plane crew. And these range from lower yields, but we're not entirely sure how high, up to 170 kilotons. So for comparison, the Russian bomb was around 15 kilotons. So we're talking, when we're talking about the range of yields, this includes bombs that are 10 times more powerful, more than 10 times more powerful on the US side. And also a small number, so about 25 submarine-launched ballistic missiles, the W-76-2, which was launched under the Trump administration. That has a yield of around 5 or 8 kilotons, so approximately half or a third of the Hiroshima bomb. On the Russian side, they have many more and much more varied holdings of these weapons. So they, at the start of this year, they were estimated to have just over 1,900 of these weapons, and they range from cruise and ballistic missiles to air-launched bombs and missiles, rockets, depth bombs and torpedoes and air defense systems. And for the Russian weapons, where there's a known estimated yields that range for most of them is between 10 kilotons and 100 kilotons, but there are a very small number that are much higher, 350 kilotons. So I think from that very short summary, we can see almost immediately that we're not talking about small nuclear weapons at all. I mean, I don't use the term low yield. You'll see that bandied around sometimes, because really we're still talking about even the very smallest ones being orders of magnitude more powerful than any conventional weapon. And as I've just described, most of them actually being more powerful than the Hiroshima bomb. What does distinguish them is that they tend to have shorter ranges, but really we're just talking about weapons that don't fall under the bilateral New START treaty, and therefore weapons that aren't currently restricted under any arms control agreements. Turning to, I should say something about terminology. So tactical in quotation marks is the term that we've got for the webinar today, and those the quotation marks are used advisedly. You can also sometimes see these weapons described as non-strategic. Again, I would challenge that, and I'm sure the other speakers and most of the people here today would as well, because really any use of nuclear weapons is strategic in its nature. And in fact, the scenario that people discuss when they talk about the fears that they might be used in relation to the Ukraine war, that wouldn't be a tactical use. It wouldn't be used for a tactical purpose. It would be used for a strategic purpose. So the term that I've used in my work is lower yield rather than low yield, because although they are very large, they are on average a little smaller than what are termed strategic weapons. Turning to the UK, because this is a subject that's not very well discussed or often discussed. The UK had a tactical, sorry, not a tactical, a lower yield component to its Trident weapon system when that weapon system was launched in the 1990s. This is something the government was unabashed about discussing, but it's something that hasn't been discussed for a long time. We at Nuclear Information Service have just published a report that covers some ground on this, and drawing together all the evidence, it seems that lower yield capability was a variant of the UK's Trident warhead, where the secondary stage of the warhead had been replaced with a dummy component that wouldn't explode with an explosive yield. That would have had, I think, probably a yield very similar to the US W76-2, the submarine launched weapon I mentioned previously. So that would be around 5 or 8 kilotons. It's possible that this UK variant was phased out or put on ice during the 2010s. As I said, we haven't heard very much about it for a while, and the transparency about operationally deployed warheads and missiles would have made it a bit more difficult for the government to do what had previously been the case, where they would go to sea with missiles loaded with different numbers of warheads, or some warheads with the lower yield variant, so they had several strike options available to them. With the integrated review that came out early last year, they've scrapped all of that transparency. We now no longer have any information about the operationally deployed number of warheads. This will allow the government to put submarines to sea with a larger warhead load, and also potentially to recommence the practice of having a range of strike options on the submarines, taken with some of the language in the integrated review, which, and we can talk maybe in the Q&A about sort of the doctrines that are used to justify these weapons. Some of that language might suggest that they are interested in or have begun recommence the practice of putting these lower yield weapons to sea. So yeah, we don't know for certain, but that may well be the case. Okay, that's probably everything I wanted to cover for the initial my initial talk. Looking forward to the Q&A and the other speakers.
Thanks very much indeed, David. Now we turn to Rebecca Johnson. Rebecca is a Vice President of CND. She's also Director of the Acronym Institute for Disarmament Diplomacy, and she's an ICAN steering group partner. Welcome, Rebecca. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Kate. And hi, everyone. I'm really glad that CND is convening this important webinar on this very, very vital subject, because let's face it, the question really that everybody's asking one way or another is, will they, won't they? Will Putin use nuclear weapons? And they talk about it as, will the taboo against nuclear weapons hold? But what kind of taboo actually was there? There were practices, but it doesn't look as if there's a taboo that sufficiently holds. And if it breaks, what are the consequences? And that's really what I want to talk about. And, you know, I just this week, just a couple of days ago, saw in the Financial Times a comment saying something like it's counter-argued that Putin would not use nuclear weapons so close to Russian territory for fear of contaminating his own country. But senior US officials point out that the smallest tactical nuclear weapons might kill hundreds of people rather than thousands, and devastate and irradiate just a few square miles. And it's that kind of talk that I think we have to really be thinking about. We have to recognize how, who is talking about tactical nuclear weapons and also why. There is a manipulation, I think, going on here of the sort of nuclear deterrence rhetoric being kind of rebranded to accommodate some uses of nuclear weapons in war. And maybe the belief in, or the faith, or whatever it was in the doctrines of nuclear deterrence, kind of also being turned into a different kind of belief system that's actually a rather old one that predated the whole notion of tactical nuclear weapons. And that is that nuclear weapons can be used in war and won't be quite so catastrophic after all. And I'm very glad to follow on from David talking in very important technical terms about what we, or rather what the military language tends to point at. Are we talking, what is a tactical nuclear weapons? What is a sub-strategic, a non-strategic? And I think we have to really question these. And then, of course, there is another one, which is the intermediate or the medium range. And of course, that came into parlance when we were trying to get rid of the medium range, the so-called theater nuclear weapons of cruise missiles, Pershing, SS-20s back in the 1980s. And, Russia, Putin and Trump got rid of the treaty that banned and eliminated those. So what are we talking about? We're talking about what some pundits want to call a demonstration or a shot across the bows. Remember Malcolm Rivkin talking about that at the end of the Cold War, trying to rebrand that Trident could be used for this sub-strategic use of a shot across the bows. Now, this was also used to really unfortunate effect by the UK and a couple of others during the negotiations in the International Court of Justice on basically the use and threat of nuclear weapons. And it actually resulted in them not making a very clear determination that any use of nuclear weapons would be banned, because this notion of tactical or sub-strategic was supposed to be small enough not to do very much damage. Then second one is the so-called battlefield nuclear weapons, the kind of ground-launched artillery that or the airdropped bombs, such as both Russia and the US deployed in Europe throughout the Cold War and still deploy even now, like the B-61-12s in the NATO bases of Germany, Belgium, Italy, Turkey, Netherlands, and also maybe soon to be redeployed in UK at Lakenheath. And thirdly, 1 or 2 nuclear weapons used to bomb what I heard in one webinar, a pundit for one of the newspapers, basically referring to as a political target. And here we have a lot of not just military pundits, but journalists maybe trying to show off their prowess at deploying military jargon and sounding very big, but it's euphemisms. What was meant by a political target, the jargon, counter-value, another jargon, was not just a bridge, but the whole city. If a nuclear weapon is used, even, as we heard from David, the kind of size of Hiroshima, and we saw the devastation of that in numerous pictures. So if you're thinking small, be aware that this is really comparable, that what they're talking about as tactical is comparable with Hiroshima and Nagasaki level destruction, and possibly up to 10 times greater. So then thirdly, I want to really think about the impacts that any of these, as we know from Hiroshima, as we know from nuclear testing, would involve massive blasts. Let's talk about, say, an airburst nuclear weapon just above ground level. We're talking about massive blasts that destroys the whole city, destroys all the people, or a large number of people in it, you know, at certain distances from the so-called ground zero, but would utterly devastate Ukraine. The fires, which would cause firestorms, which would kill even more. The radioactive clouds, and then the fallout causing, you know, radiation sickness of various levels, depending on how close you are, but also starvation, because the radiated food, if people start eating that food, that stores up enormous kinds of damage in the future. So these would be catastrophic in spreading these kinds of effects, even if just one so-called tactical nuclear weapon of the kind of size that David was talking about were to be used on a bridge that happened to be, as most bridges are, in a town, in a city, somewhere. So do we call this Armageddon? Any use of nuclear weapons, let's be clear about this, any use of nuclear weapons would be strategic in intent and strategic in impact. Any kind of retaliation could escalate the war. We already know about technologies such as artificial intelligence and cyber and various other kinds of technologies and fixes attached to enabling prompt or hair trigger alert postures. These are shortened decision times, shortened time to respond if a nuclear weapon of any size were to be used. And so that then that revives all those Cold War fears of decapitating nuclear strikes, the desire, the crisis escalation where a leader ends up unleashing as many nuclear weapons as they can against at least the forces that they think might threaten them. So then we are back to the whole notion of a Russian NATO, a Russian US involvement, all-out nuclear war, trying to prevent having that kind of strike done against you. You create the very strike. Well, some also hope, or wish perhaps, that if a nuclear weapon were used, the shock would lead to nuclear disarmament. I'd really like to believe that, and indeed it's one of the scenarios that I talked about in my report for CND, actually done with NIS as well. The nuclear weapons are banned. What does this mean for Britain? That was published earlier this year. Such a shock could indeed lead to nuclear disarmament, but let's actually try to create the political shock and not allow the physical nuclear use shock. Ultimately, the only sure way to prevent nuclear use is to ban and eliminate all nuclear weapons, and that's really what we need to be doing now. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed, Rebecca. A lot of food for thought there. We turn now to our final speaker. Big welcome to Paul Rogers. Paul is Emeritus Professor of Peace Studies at the University of Bradford, and he's Global Security Consultant with the Oxford Research Group. So big welcome to you, Paul. Unmute yourself, please.
I always do that. Thanks very much, Kate, for inviting me to take part. It's a hugely timely seminar, and all power to CND for putting it on this evening. Let me start with just a personal anecdote. About 36 years ago, towards the end of the 1980s, NATO used to run what it called briefing sessions for relevant people, which could be senior church people, senior academics, certainly plenty of senior politicians of the rest, to go and get a briefing on NATO policy with a fair bit of emphasis on nuclear policy. I went on one of those along with other academics, and we were given a pretty good view of what NATO thought the situation was, the huge preponderance as it saw it of Warsaw Pact forces, the risk of a sudden surprise assault through the Fulda Gap into North Germany, and all that might follow from that. And in that context, NATO's policy, which dated back to the 1960s, 68 to be precise, MC14-3, was one of flexible response in nuclear weapons use, which included the early first use of tactical nuclear weapons against essentially some sort of Soviet onslaught. We had a briefing on that. It wasn't very detailed, and there wasn't too much of sort of crossing the T's and dotting the I's. Over coffee that morning, I talked to a German civil servant, a senior civil servant who'd been deputed to the NATO Nuclear Planning Group, which was the high-level body which sort of confirmed the different strategies. And I asked him what was meant by this idea of a demonstration shot. And he said, well, if you had the situation where we'd been caught by surprise and the Soviets were pouring through the Fulda Gap and really getting the upper hand against combined NATO forces, under those circumstances, what we might choose to do would be to fire one or more demonstration shots using very low power nuclear weapons. The implication was maybe 2 kilotons, something like that, a fraction of the Hiroshima bomb, and explode them very high up in the sky, very high altitude. There may be problems with the electronics underneath, but there wouldn't necessarily be any deaths. But what we would show to the Russians, the Soviets, was we meant business. And this was time was to cause a halt, or we would go the full hog. And he was quite candid about this. He thought it was obviously a very good policy to use in those very difficult circumstances. I then asked him, well, how would the Soviets respond? How you predicted that? And it got rather woolly then in terms of what the response might be. But NATO did believe at that time that using tactical nuclear weapons first might well be appropriate. And that's part of a very long thread, for example, in British nuclear thinking. You can go really right back to the 1950s at the start of Britain having nuclear weapons that could be deployed. And there was a quote from Harold Macmillan, who was actually the defense minister at the time, later prime minister in the early 1970s, where he said that one option, if you were using nuclear weapons against a non-nuclear power, at that time that might have been China, then you would use them in the early stages to allow you to bring your main forces in, your main conventional forces, and of course your opponent would not be able to respond to nuclear weapons. And if you go right through the history of British involvement, is thoroughly involved with the NATO planning, but also there were very strong indications that if push came to shove, Britain would be prepared to use small yield nuclear weapons in the first Iraq War in 1991, possibly the second in 2003, and without a doubt, Britain did deploy nuclear weapons on task force ships in the Falklands-Malvinas War back in 1982. So there's a long history of this in Britain. One question I think which follows on very much from what Rebecca and David was saying is, well, why is Russia particularly interested in this at the present time? And here I think you have to understand that the Russians back in the 1990s, when their economy was almost collapsing, one of the very things they tried to preserve was a fairly thoroughgoing nuclear capability. They had very weak conventional forces by the end of the 1990s, but they did have the nuclear forces and they did upgrade those wherever they could. So to them, it's a kind of reverse of the position that NATO thought it was in back in the 1980s. Only this time, from the mid-1990s onwards, it was Russia that saw itself well behind the NATO powers. Even though NATO had cleared out many of its tactical nuclear weapons, as indeed had some of the Russian weapons as well, Russia was basically pitting more strategy on the nuclear option of going in if need be, in a worst case scenario, admittedly. And that, I think, is where Putin found himself within a few days of the start of the Ukraine war. It was going terribly wrong when he expected that within 2 or 3 days they would have actually taken Kyiv and got the government more to their liking. I'll put it politely like that. And the essence is that first Sunday, you know, the war started on the 24th, a Thursday. By Sunday, Putin was very frustrated at the lack of progress. And that was when he warned NATO not to interfere or else there will be a risk of nuclear use. That's the kind of context we're dealing with, but I think one has to be clear that all the major nuclear powers at different times have made it clear they would go first in certain circumstances with very low yield weapons. They talk about demonstration shots, maybe one step up from that. And in the case of the early years of the British use of nuclear weapons, it was a question of the possibility of, the phrase was, small nuclear wars in far off places. That does not mean that we're there now with Ukraine, but I have to say the danger is much more high than it has been in recent years. And it brings us right back to what I find is a lack of understanding by most people that nuclear weapons are not seen solely by the powers that be as the ultimate deterrence ensuring stability. Anybody who's looked at the history of nuclear accidents, nuclear weapons going missing and never recovered, near misses in wartime, the Able Archer incident in 1983, where the Soviets mistook a major NATO exercise involving cruise missiles for preparation for the real thing, and of course Cuba back in 1982, where there were horrendous misjudgments, and we were very lucky, in fact, that that didn't escalate. The point about all of this, I think, and this is why it's so important, and I'll finish more or less now and leave time for questions, is the nuclear issue worldwide is not what people think, by and large. The risk is, under certain circumstances, greater than we tend to expect or even think. Now, that is something which I wish was much better known than it is. It can be so. I think it's a very important part of CND's work to do this. And of course, the other side of the coin, and Rebecca knows this far better than I, is there are many states within the UN system that want an end to nuclear weapons. And we have the Nuclear Weapons Treaty, and I don't know how many states have signed up to that now. I think it's heading up towards 60 that actually ratified it. And the essential thing is that is really another movement underway. Many states want out of this. It doesn't imply to the 9 current nuclear weapon states who don't want to know, but there is the possibility that we may actually recognize the dangers of nuclear weapons, possibly even in the next year or so, and move those steps farther forward. If that's so, that would be very good, but it's going to depend very much on the campaigning and information spreading efforts of the likes of CND. So all power to that effort. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much indeed, Paul. Great. Okay, so we've got questions coming in now. I'm going to take them in groups of 3, and then I'll read them out and then I'll put them to the panel and they can pick up the aspects and elements that they wish to do so. So first of all, Jane Shallis has asked a question, which I think many people have this question too. What is the difference between tactical and strategic nuclear weapons? So that's let's try and clarify that. And then Andrew Lohman, he says, I fear that people of a conservative viewpoint think because the Soviet Union had always backed down, now Russia will again. But if you read the recent blogs from Scientists for Global Responsibility, we have considerably more weaponry, and Russia now might think all or nothing. Is this reasonable reasoning for pulling back from war? So there's that. And then Alan Debenham says, Putin says he can wipe out the UK with one press of the button using his latest multi-warheaded intercontinental ballistic missile set on all major conurbations. Is this true? Okay, so some nice meaty questions for you there, panel. Who would like to go first?
I'll tackle that last one, if I may.
Yes.
Could Russia actually more or less destroy Britain? The answer is without question, yes. There's no doubt about that. And in fact, we know now, in fact, information that came out from the Home Office about 25 years ago, well after the Cold War, was that the assessment at the time was that a major nuclear attack on Britain would kill 40 million out of the 56 million population, most of those in the first few hours. And the country would be more or less devastated. There's some evidence that, in fact, the British government actually thought it would be worse than that, and that the country would be literally destroyed. The impact, of course, would also be a nuclear winter affecting much of the Northern Hemisphere, if not more. And without doubt, it would affect Western Europe, Eastern Europe, and probably the Soviet Union as well in terms of fallout. So it would be a suicide weapon in many ways. But the specific question is, could Britain be destroyed by Russia in the event of an all-out war? The answer, I'm afraid, is yes.
Okay, Rebecca, over to you.
Yes, I have to say I completely agree. And I also was very troubled to read that one of the ideas that was being canvassed by some Russian planners had to do with an extremely large, a megaton level nuclear weapon detonated below the ocean from a submarine below the ocean at a strategic location that would cause a massive tsunami that would destroy all the coastal cities for most of Scandinavia and Europe, including, of course, the UK. I don't know, and maybe Paul can comment on whether that's also something that is possible. Do I think it's likely? Probably not, because I can't see how Russia could imagine doing that without pretty much destroying a large amount, segment of part of Russia. But of course, Russia is land-based, much more so than a lot of European countries. So these are some of the things that we actually have to recognize, and these are some of the things that could be triggered by a use of nuclear weapons that on the face of it looked small, that was intended to be tactical. And that really answers that first question. What's the difference between them? And I actually think ultimately there is none. It's a matter of potentially size or range and language.
Yes.
And language is about policy. Language is about euphemism. Language is about sanitizing in our heads the idea that nuclear weapons actually could be used and they wouldn't be quite as bad as we imagine. And I think that that's something that's extremely dangerous. And I also think it goes along with, how in the UK, it's virtually become embedded that declaring a willingness to launch Trident is treated as a litmus test of fitness to lead, of fitness to be a prime minister. This is a dangerous delusion. No one is fit to be a leader if they are so ambitious or weak that they are actually afraid to explain what launching Trident would really mean, if they are afraid to question, if they are afraid to refuse pressures to launch nuclear weapons, then they're unfit for leadership. And if a leader is prepared to use nuclear weapons, let's be very clear, they are essentially agreeing to threaten, risk, and carry out the mass annihilation of whole countries and everything that they and we care about. So let's not be fooled that there's some, definitional difference and a tactical nuclear weapons usable and okay. And we're only really worried about Soviet Union, Russia destroying with strategic. And just one last point on that. Scientists for Global Responsibility, Phil Weber and Stuart Parkinson, did some years ago when we were doing the heavy lifting to really convince politicians and a lot of countries of the dangers of the illusions of nuclear deterrence. They did a study that looked at if just one nuclear armed British submarine were to unleash the weapons on board, understood at that time to be about 40 warheads on about 8 missiles, that itself unleashed at 6 to 8 cities in Russia could be enough to create those dust clouds, not just the radioactive fallout, but the dust clouds that would encircle and entomb the earth and cause the abrupt global freezing that we know of as nuclear winter, with everything that that entails, including mass starvation. So yes, they could destroy us, and we also, with just one trident, could create something that would also destroy a huge part of the world, and us as well.
Thanks, Rebecca. David, things to add there?
Not very much. I think that was very exhaustive in the main. Yeah, I would just re-emphasize what Rebecca was saying, and also in her original talk. There is no meaningful distinction between what are called strategic and what are called tactical nuclear weapons. They're built the same. They do the same thing. You can, bandy words about the relative size of the two, but I think it's really important not to, and to draw a red line and say these are all unacceptable. They're all, devastating beyond imagining. Jeffrey Lewis, who is an arms control analyst in the US, and rather fond of gallows humor, spoke when the W76-2 was announced about the sort of Goldilocks nuclear weapon size that these enthusiasts who were, very much on the rise in the Trump administration were trying to find nuclear weapon sizes that were just right, that they could imagine using them. And I think it's really important for those of us with a more sane bent to say they're all unacceptable, they're all devastating, and they should never be used.
The other question that was asked was whether Russia has backed down before and would back down again. You've got to be very careful on this. I use an acronym, AIM, A-I-M, which stands for Accident, Incident, or Maverick. And those are basically headings for the kinds of things which can tip a crisis into something much worse. And they'd be quite untoward, unexpected, unplanned, but do it nevertheless. So that at least is one good reason for not basically putting your faith in one side or the other backing down. And I agree wholeheartedly with what David and Rebecca said. In my mind of thinking, any state which believes it has to have this capacity should be termed a rogue state, of which there are 9, including Britain, France, China, the United States, Russia, India, Pakistan, and of course North Korea. I think that's the lot, and Israel, of course. So in a sense, I think all of those can be considered rogue states, because part of their defense posture depends on this extraordinary idea that you can cause nuclear war as part of your defenses.
Thanks very much. Okay, we'll take.
Kate, could I just butt in one thing?
Sure.
If people want any detail of this, then Declassified UK did a report basically on Britain's tactical nuclear weapons and the rest. And if this works right, I will try and get a link to it before the end of the program anyway, so that people can clock onto it. Okay.
Brilliant. Thanks very much. Okay, let's go into another round of questions then. So Neil Bullyman says, the doctrine predominantly for tactical nuclear weapons is a throwback to the Cold War days, where these low yield weapons would negate the old Soviet numerical tank advantage. In a modern context, would the deployment and use of a single weapon start a dangerous escalation, therefore widening the Russia-Ukraine conflict? Tony Goodger is raising the question of contamination of land. He says the land in Ukraine is used primarily to grow grain, which feeds much of Africa and the Middle East, as well as within Europe. Any nuclear strike will destroy the agriculture, which will cause mass starvation in other parts of the world. And he's saying that this surely must be the strongest argument for full nuclear disarmament. I don't know if any of you would want to make any comments about the kind of environmental impact in a little more depth. And then Barbara Coulson says, how worried should we be about North and South Korea using nuclear weapons? So that's your next 3 questions. So who's first this time?
I can go first this time then.
Go ahead, Rebecca.
So yes, okay, so first question is, again, going back to this notion of a tactical nuclear weapon, saying that it was a throwback to the Cold War. Well, yeah, kind of yes and no. I mean, the thing about the Cold War was that there were quite a lot of iterations of different forms of deterrence, partly driven by, you know, whatever the weapons makers could get funded to make on both sides. And remember that both US and Soviet economies became very heavily dependent on military, on arms production of all kinds, but nuclear is included in that. So, you know, they went between sort of mutual assured destruction, which was assumed to be strategic, to the smaller things. And let's face it, the cruise missiles being deployed in the 80s was supposed to be part of reassuring Americans, bizarrely, that somehow a nuclear weapon, a nuclear war could be fought in the European theater, so-called, and be won. And of course, for those of us living in Europe, that was Armageddon. So we said no, and we got rid of them, and we got the treaty that got rid of them. And that led to the next treaty, which got rid of the nuclear testing, or at least pretty well ended them. And then, of course, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons most recently. So, you know, let's understand that whatever the intent of the use of a so-called short range, you know, tactical or short range or sub-strategic or shot across demonstration shot, the fact is, as Paul eloquently said, it could cause escalation by fear, by mistake, by miscalculation, by sheer bad luck, the wrong people in the wrong place, unable to stop the escalation and the retaliation from being launched. Second question on radiation and environmental impacts. I think we really have to understand that these are very, very serious as possibilities, the way the war in Ukraine is going. Let's recognize that any use of nuclear weapons by Russia in Ukraine would be bizarre in the sense of a warfare that is supposed to be about occupying territory or actually liberating territory, and as Putin talks about, you know, for the people who live there. Of course it would do no such thing, and the contamination that would come from even a rather small use of nuclear weapons would have, you know, massive impacts in terms of food growing, food resources, agriculture, economy, development, all of these things that are referred to in the preamble. In particularly, I refer you to paragraph 4 of the preamble in the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, that really links that you know, any radioactive event would transcend national borders, and it would affect the environment, socio-economic development, global economies, food security, not just local or regional, but global, and the health of current and future generations, also having a disproportionate impact on women and girls, including as a result of ionizing radiation. And let's also recognize that any major use of explosives on Zaporizhia nuclear power plant or on Chernobyl, which is still part of the territory we're talking about, would have the impact of a massive dirty bomb that could be much greater in the way that it releases radioactivity than the Chernobyl of the horrendous Chernobyl accident of 1986. And you know, these dirty bombs, any nuclear power plant is a dirty bomb in somebody's imagination. Nevertheless, I would still say that any use of an actual nuclear weapon would be even more catastrophic than those.
Thanks.
North and South Korea. I'm going to leave that to,
okay.
Paul to respond, and if there's anything I can add, I will come back to.
Thanks very much. Paul?
Very quickly on that, and I'll leave the rest for David, obviously. On North and South Korea, North Korea does now have nuclear weapons. Nobody really knows how many. It's probably a pretty small number, and they see it as a means of preventing them being invaded by South Korea and the Americans. Whether there's any possibility of that is neither here nor there. That's why they have them. South Korea itself has not developed its own nuclear weapons. It relies on what is called the American nuclear umbrella. Is there a risk of war escalating? Yes, there is. It doesn't necessarily mean that it will go nuclear. I think one of the things that is causing concern, though, is that because the nuclear issue is still there and live, an autocrat such as Kim himself would see nuclear weapons as necessary to North Korea's defenses. And of course, that will also apply to some other countries. What is happening in Iran at the present time is another example of that. And we really are at the stage where we really have to renew efforts to prevent further proliferation. It mustn't go further than it has. And we have to find some way, ultimately, and this is a matter, I think, very much for the North and South Koreans, of actually bringing North Korea into the fold. That will probably involve the cooperation of Beijing as well. But in the short term, there's the small risk there of an escalation to nuclear war. Hopefully not, but you can't rule it out, because there always is that danger, as indeed there always is the danger of an untoward, unplanned escalation between Pakistan and India over a future crisis. These things have not gone away. And I think one of the problems is people have got lulled into a false sense of security, whereas now is the time to do, as Rebecca would argue very strongly, go for a proper treaty, a convention which fits worldwide and get more countries to sign up to it.
Thanks, Paul. Absolutely. David?
On the doctrine, yeah, I wanted to say a bit about the justifications for the new US lower yield submarine launched weapon and the potential reactivation of the UK's capability. These are justified very much in terms of this idea that Russia might use a demonstrative strike. And the idea is that it's important for the UK and or the US to have a weapon of a similar size to respond to. This is the sort of Goldilocks size that I was referring to earlier. And it's extraordinarily dangerous, this idea that were that to happen, the US and UK should have the option to respond in kind. There's, I think, an idea that somehow the other side will be cowed by this. And I think that's just a monstrous misunderstanding of how the dynamics of escalation, that actually all it would do would be to heighten tensions, to make the stakes much higher, to make opponents less willing to back down and more insistent that they should be seen to respond in kind and to not be cowed. So I think it's extraordinarily dangerous, and it creates a situation where even if everybody is intent on not descending into a full-scale nuclear war, that the possibilities for miscalculation and misunderstanding are so much higher. And that's why the larger numbers of weapons, particularly weapons that have been normalized by this language, about them being called tactical and so on, and also greater numbers of possessor states, just create a more dangerous situation where the possibilities for miscalculation, for something going wrong, for somebody misunderstanding are much greater.
Thanks very much, David. So we've got time for one more round, and I'm going to pick out some of the questions which are about looking towards solutions for the current situation. Joan says, Paul mentioned the earlier dialogue between NATO and influencers. What similar dialogue takes place today, or what opportunities are there for this, including with all the political parties? And then Tim Street, I'm just going to take the last element from Tim's question. He says, instead of focusing on military capabilities, how can we use diplomacy to end the conflict? And then Alan Debenham It's drawing us back to the recent review conference. In this year's latest UN 5-yearly review of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and further discussion of the TPNW, what did the UK Tory government put forward? And in general, what were the results of the 2022 review talks? So if you'd like to comment on those things and maybe give us some pointers for how we think there could potentially be a kind of way through this increasingly disastrous situation. So our first taker.
Well, shall I just do quick answers on two of them, then I'm sure other people will come in. Are there currently the same sorts of briefings that NATO was giving in the 1980s? Not that I'm aware of. But on the other hand, I think it always makes sense for ordinary people to try and get in touch with the information people in NATO, or indeed with the Ministry of Defence, because our own government has made it clear that it's going to do its best not to talk about these things in public, as David was saying earlier on. So I think it's really pressure from below may encourage people to be a little bit more straightforward in what they really think they are doing. On the issue of diplomacy in Ukraine, that, Tim, is really a much bigger topic. The one thing that worries me currently is there's no indication that Putin actually wants to deal in talks. Maybe some of the people around him do, but not him. But I also suspect that on the Western side, among the more hawkish elements in London and particularly in Washington, they prefer the war to go on, because essentially it's a way of weakening Russia, both militarily and economically. So if you're looking at these things in terms of long-term strategy and the creation of new superpowers, if Russia basically is held back a lot, it makes it less easy for a kind of Russian-Chinese axis to develop. And I think there's an element in there. There are discussions going on informally, but very little in the way of track 2 diplomacy, the informal discussions. As I understand it, the Western governments at the top are not too keen on them. They'd actually prefer to see this war go on rather longer, in spite of the human costs. It's a very tough thing to say, but there's enough circumstantial evidence that that is part of current thinking, I'm afraid.
Thanks. Terrible. Okay, David or Rebecca? David?
I'm sure I'll say something about the Revcon, and then I'm sure you'll have more to say about it, Rebecca. I'm limited in what I can say, but I attended a briefing with some civil servants who were representing our government about the Revcon, and they did speak about what the UK had done, and it was only last week. It's under Chatham House rules, so I can't say too much, but honestly I don't remember very much about what they claimed to have achieved, because the nuclear armed states did not put very much on the table at all. They have no plan or offer for how they will fulfill their obligations under that treaty. I would say that the negotiations, I think, demonstrated that, you know, the very laudable patience and understanding and commitment of the non-nuclear armed states in the treaty to prop up a treaty, even though their partners who are nuclear armed are not fulfilling their obligations. That, you know, the treaty is very problematic in a lot of ways, and the TPNW is a much better treaty in a lot of ways. But I think it speaks to the ongoing interest and commitment of the vast majority of the world states to a nuclear-free world, that they were prepared to sign up to an extraordinarily underwhelming and unsatisfactory agreement at the end, because they didn't want to see greater nuclear proliferation. There is a chink of light there, but not a very large one, I'll admit.
Thanks very much, David. Rebecca, I'm sure you can give us a lot of useful information about this.
Well, yes, a certain amount, because I did attend part of the NPT Review Conference, but I agree with how David has characterized. Really, they had very little to offer. They very much hid behind the generalized kind of uniting of the NPT states parties against Russia over the war on Ukraine and all the concerns raised in relation to Zaporizhia as a nuclear power plant endangered by the war. Also, I have to say, sadly, they were really trying to dodge bullets. dodge criticisms of the so-called integrated review and the increase on the cap on nuclear weapons. That was, in that. Also tried to dodge Chinese concerns raised about the AUKUS, the Australian, US, UK deal over nuclear-fueled submarines, which again is about long-range strategic submarines. Even if they are not designed to carry nuclear weapons, they're all part of that set of issues of force projection, and from Australia, of course, within the areas of the Pacific and Indian Ocean that China is most concerned about. But most of all, the UK was just really linking arms on this one, kind of paradoxically, with Russia and China, but also, of course, with France, in really giving themselves brownie points on promoting nuclear technologies, nuclear fuel technologies of across the board, virtually, selling the technologies and the wares and the notion of atoms for peace, the notion under the NPT of fulfilling Article 4, which more and more was looking very, very dangerous and very, very stupid. By contrast, I just want to draw your attention to the first meeting of states parties to the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. This was held in Vienna, the home of the International Atomic Energy Agency, the home also of the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty Organization and various other areas of nuclear expertise. This was held in June under the auspices of the Austrian government and the UN. I was a bit surprised. I think maybe it was a bit of a misspeak, Paul, when you said that we needed a proper treaty. The TPNW is most certainly a proper treaty. It is a UN treaty. It already has 91 signatories and a third of the UN membership. Almost a third of the UN membership signed up as states parties, which is further than the NPT had got at a similar time following its adoption in 1968. And by contrast with the complete failure of the NPT to adopt any agreed final document at all, what we saw in Vienna was the government's adopting a strong declaration titled Our Commitment to a World Free of Nuclear Weapons, but also a 50-point practical action plan, which provides innovative legal and normative tools to raise awareness of nuclear impacts and strengthen activism to bring nuclear armed states on board and to implement the treaty. And the key decisions, specific decisions, were 10-year deadlines for destroying nuclear arsenals as nuclear armed states begin to approach the treaty, a 90-day deadline for any NATO host country to remove nuclear weaponry from their territories and policies, the establishment of an international scientific advisory group to work on verification and technical issues. The principles and objectives of the verification and implementation issues are in the treaty, but this group in intersessional working sessions is to look in more detail to help build up the verification on technical issues, plus initiatives on intersessional work on cooperation, on bringing all governments on board, on taking forward, assisting the indigenous people, the victims of nuclear use and testing, of the environmental remediation issues. And of course, these are all legacy issues that nevertheless are absolutely necessary for the world in going forward. And then also in fulfilling the treaty's objectives of banning and eliminating all nuclear arsenals through strong, effective verification and compliance mechanisms. So this is what that treaty is doing. And then it was agreed that Mexico would take on the next meeting of states parties in November at the UN in New York. So we have the treaty. But of course, we have to make it work.
Thanks, Rebecca. Great timing. So our hour is up. So that was absolutely fantastically interesting, really, really very useful. If people want now to take action going forward, of course, there are many ways you can do that through C&D local groups and lobbying. And we've got online, we have an online lobbying system for speaking to your MP about the risks of the war and the risks of nuclear weapons use and so on. But if you want to actually go out there and take some action about US tactical nuclear weapons coming back to the UK, we have a big protest organised at RAF USAF Lakenheath on Saturday, the 19th of November. In case you haven't heard about this, there used to be US nuclear weapons at the Lakenheath Air Base in Suffolk. They were got rid of around about 2008 because of persistent protest against them. And now there couldn't be a worse context in which to bring those US nuclear weapons back to Britain, putting us even more on the front line than we already are. So if you can, please do come along to Lakenheath and join us. And I've put the link there to the information on the C&D website in the chat. And of course, there are various coaches and things going. You can get trains and then get picked up at stations and all kinds of things. So please do come along and join us. If you can't do that on that day, please do take up one of the options for campaigning to prevent nuclear war. So again, big thank you to David, to Paul and to Rebecca. Fantastically interesting. This will be available on our website, so please do share it and spread this vital information. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you all. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.